I wanted to begin by showing you two recent artworks, which of course are not by Joyce Wieland, but very directly inspired by one of her most iconic works. So I'm quickly showing you here this pair of original bilingual Reason Over Passion works from 1968, quilted cloth assemblages that feature words spoken by then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. That was supposedly how he conducted himself and what he considered politics to be all about. And so Wieland decided to seize hold of these words, giving them an unexpected material form, and thereby altering their meaning. So, coming back to these two works, both of these newer works reverse the reason-passion equation. In the case of Cynthia Girard, a very talented and inventive painter, she told me that her discovery of Joyce Wieland happened fairly recently, since her Francophone art school education happened to omit this English-Canadian artist. But she immediately recognized a kindred spirit in Wieland's play with everyday materials, her humor, use of language, and willingness to directly address the political issues of the day. So here, what you're seeing on the right is a detail showing that Girard's painting contains little messages almost hidden from view. That's what it says at the top, and that is a real Wieland touch, this idea that there are kind of hidden things. In the case of Mark Klintberg, he designed this real quilt, which was beautifully handmade by a collective of craftswomen on Fogo Island in Newfoundland. And it could be said that he enhances the sense of irony that was already present when Wieland took that political utterance and introduced it onto a quilt-like object. We might well ask, in the bedroom, which term should be ascendant on top? So I began with those images to emphasize that today, perhaps more than ever, Joyce Wieland's extraordinary and multifaceted artworks are valorized and influential. And this is definitely the case amongst a younger generation of artists, curators, and art historians. Nor is this the case only in Canada. Wieland was also included in this international exhibition of women pop artists held at the Brooklyn Museum a few years back. So on the right, what you're seeing, that's one of her assemblages from the mid-60s, which also appeared then on the home page for the show. And she'd previously been one of the few Canadian artists included in the landmark exhibition Global Conceptualism, this time because of quite different conceptual work. This was the artist's book that she produced to accompany her solo exhibition at the National Gallery in 1971. And there she layered photographs and text onto a pre-existing book about Arctic flowers, and in that way creating a complex picture of the northern Canadian landscape. So that's some of the open pages and some other open pages, and then here you see Wieland reenacting Laura Secor's heroic walk in 1813, alerting the home troops about an imminent US attack. So I'm showing you this because this is evidence, really, that during the peak of her career, the 1960s and 70s, Joyce Wieland was a full participant in major international art movements. And what remains astonishing about Wieland's artistic career is that it did encompass so many different modes and materials. I originally became interested in her work because of her idiosyncratic approach to landscape within the Canadian tradition. So she would come up with this, what I just showed you, this historically oriented performance that then gets packaged in photographic and conceptual terms, but then, what you're seeing on top, there's this massive, brightly colored cloth work, which pokes fun, in a very good-natured way, at the Canadian obsession with wilderness landscape imagery, or at least that's one interpretation. Only slowly did I become aware of a strong body of pop artworks, of conceptual projects. Then there are a whole series of works that use stitching, knitting, and embroidery. There's a whole category of works that experiment with language. So here are a couple of examples. And then, of course, Joyce Wieland was probably best known during her lifetime for her contribution to experimental film. Just to give you a sample of how celebrated she was as a filmmaker back in the day. So this is a quote from 1971 by the American film critic Andrew Sarris, and I will just read it to you. "The talented Canadian Joyce Wieland leads the contingent of women filmmakers in the experimental, abstract, poetic, avant-garde, underground categories." So, yeah. I'm not actually going to say too much about the films today, because I do want to showcase other aspects of her art practice. But let me backtrack a bit to the beginnings of Joyce Wieland's career. In this photo from 1955, we see the artist as a young woman of 24 years old. And many of you know, because you did know her personally, that Wieland was born in Toronto, the child of British immigrants who passed away when she was quite young. And this meant that she and her older siblings faced some hard times, and it was always understood that Wieland would have to make her own way in the world and work for a living. So she studied design, a practical choice, at Central Technical School, although this was also where she encountered painters, including her teacher, Doris McCarthy, who was quite influential. And from that point on, she began experimenting with figuration and abstraction through the late 50s. So this was the period when various forms of abstraction, including abstract expressionism and color field painting, took hold across North America. And of course, here in Toronto, the Painters 11 group were committed to exploring form, color, line, movement, and composition. Wieland did that too, and became very accomplished, formally speaking. But she certainly didn't devote herself to pure abstraction for very long. She began adding words and graffiti-like scribbles to abstract paintings, and appending cloth and other objects to her canvases. So this is a very dynamic, lively composition. But the title, Redgasm, tells us that something more than abstract play is at stake. One blue sphere, this one right here, is labeled me, while interspersed amongst these shapes are lightly scrawled arrows and phallic shapes. So suddenly, an abstract painting seems to describe the unpredictable vectors of sexual desire. Eroticism is one of the leitmotifs that runs through Wieland's career, becoming a quasi-aesthetic principle. Here you're seeing Joyce Wieland and Michael Snow soon after their arrival in New York City. This is 1963. Wieland and Snow had married some years prior, having met when they were both working for a company called Graphic Associates in Toronto. It was there, as part of her commercial work experience, that Wieland learned how to shoot and edit moving images. The couple would live in New York for the remainder of the 1960s. This particular year, 1963, was a tremendously fruitful one for Wieland. She painted up a storm. And by this point, she had more assertively moved beyond abstraction. Now she was painting people, objects, fragments of the urban environment, here in a canvas divided up in a kind of grid. And what I'd like to call your attention to is how there's a car viewed from up close, and then in the next frame, seen from a distance. This is like a jump cut, a technique used in film editing. And indeed, Wieland would introduce various cinematic techniques and qualities in her painting. Here are another two paintings from 1963, this time showing the artist attuned to the racial politics of the US. She did, in fact, attend the famous March on Washington. That's the title of the painting on the left. That march at which Martin Luther King delivered his famous speech, So the painting functions as a kind of pictorial memento. And then on the right, a rather different way of addressing race, this time through a fiction. The title tells us that this is a film, although the main story unfolds through a simple stacking of 3 frames. Reading from top to bottom, a white woman and a black man melt into a kiss, with little hearts bouncing around between them. And this is necessarily a fiction, because the interracial kiss she invented would not have been available to the American public at that time, either in films, on television, or in comic books. The lovers are certainly comic book-like, with mere strokes to describe closed eyes and pouting lips, and big blocks of color. So on the one hand, Wieland's art becomes critical of American cultural politics, but at the same time, as an artist, she fully embraced the vocabulary of pop culture and the logic of pop art. Painting is no longer a rarefied aesthetic practice that needs to be protected from the contamination of lowbrow entertainment. Instead, her art becomes a hybrid cultural space whereby painting can merge with aspects of the movies, comics, advertisements. Here are 2 very long vertical paintings, and this is a format that was pretty much unheard of in the history of painting. But they do evoke strips of film, even if now it's not so clear whether we're supposed to read up or down. But either way, there's an illusion of movement. On the left, the lips get closer and further away, the cigarettes move up and down. And then, I don't know how well you can see this, but in the center strips of both paintings, there are also funny little phallus shapes bobbing up and down. The painting on the right also has boats appearing and disappearing below the horizon line. So all of these elements seem to be in constant movement, like a slapstick comedy. And so the painting resembles a film strip, but Wieland also borrows her comic timing from a genre of movies. Boats became a bit of an obsession for Wieland, and she produced numerous paintings that show a single boat serenely sailing along that suddenly gets swallowed up by the waves. And what I would say about these paintings is that they show Wieland's interest in narrative. Suddenly, something happens, disaster strikes. Despite the cartoony simplicity of the painting style, and despite the repetition of the same scenario, the abrupt endings of boats sinking beneath the waves, that does turn these stories into tragedies. And there's an occasional airplane, too. These can be compared to Andy Warhol's series of disaster paintings from this same period. And Wieland herself said that she was responding to a media culture of endless sensationalism. I want to just briefly return to this painting because the title, which, sorry, I forgot to copy again, which is First Integrated Film with a Short on Sailing, informs us that there are 2 films here. And so there's a main one and a short, which is to say a short film. And that's the horizontal sequence of little images showing a sailboat, small heads in profile, and speech balloons. What Wieland did here was quite radical because there's narrative momentum and kind of a sort of temporal flow moving in 2 directions at the same time. We follow one story from top to bottom, even while our eyes simultaneously zigzag from left to right. So Wieland borrowed elements from the cinema, but her painting does something that would be impossible to accomplish with film. By the mid-60s, Wieland was experimenting with a range of materials, technologies, and found objects, and all of this took her far beyond the medium of paint. Some of Wieland's multimedia assemblages of the 1960s also mimicked the verticality of the film strip and were occasionally called movies. Here it's the middle one, which has the title Stuffed Movie. Translucent plastic envelopes have been stitched together, enclosing bits of photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal mementos. And here I'm showing you one of the works that you just saw, one of Wieland's works, alongside one by fellow Canadian artist Greg Curnow. I don't want to imply that one necessarily influenced the other, but rather that they seem to arrive at the same place around the same time. Both artists capitalizing on pop culture with an inventive comic sensibility. Although for Wieland, I would say that comedy was one of many moods and modes that she would explore. So something I do want to point out is the somewhat unfortunate disconnect that developed between Wieland's visual art practice on the one hand and her films on the other. So during this time when she was living in New York throughout the 60s, her paintings, sculptures, and assemblages continued to be shown and celebrated in Canada. So here's a poster at the gallery that represented her, the Isaacs Gallery in Toronto, and then on the right, from 1967, a 10-year retrospective of her work at the Vancouver Art Gallery. But back in New York, where she was living, she wasn't able to break into the gallery scene. Frankly, I'm not sure how hard she tried. On the other hand, New York's experimental film world was a countercultural, loosely organized downtown scene, which in its early days at least was open and friendly towards newcomers. Plus, she and Michael Snow befriended many other experimental filmmakers who were living in or passing through New York. So she was very much part of a vibrant scene. But this was an artificial divide, this divide between the visual art practice and the films. Because if we look at her artworks and films, short films from the mid to late 60s, many common concerns are evident. And most notably, Wieland got serious about integrating her political convictions into her art practice. As was true for many artists of her generation in several countries, it was the war in Vietnam that triggered this shift in consciousness. So what you see on the left is a 1966 work titled, "Betsy Ross, Look What They Did to the Flag You Made with Such Care." So Betsy Ross is the name of the woman who actually hand-stitched the very first American flag. So to begin with, here, Wieland is addressing this woman as if across time, recognizing her contribution to that idealistic moment of nation building. So this is an example of Wieland's feminist politics. The work itself does have a pop sensibility. The flag emerges like a tongue out of big red lips. But that grayish spot up there on the flag tongue is some newspaper coverage of the Vietnam War. So now appearing like a canker or wound on this symbol. And on the right is a still image from Wieland's 1968 film, Rat Life and Diet in North America. The rats in question were actually pet hamsters, but they are the stars of this film, which is about political prisoners in the US who escape over the border into Canada, where they frolic amidst fruit and flowers. So this countercultural animal fable was and is widely admired. Somebody tonight told me it's one of their favorite films of all time. And what is striking here is that Canada starts to figure prominently in Wieland's imaginative universe as the site of alternative values. So American patriotism comes up against Canadian nationalism. And so here on the right, you're seeing an artwork that was part of Wieland's, one-woman show at the National Gallery of Canada in 1971. And as we heard from Sarah, the exhibition was called True Patriot Love. It opened on July 1st, Canada Day. And the works in the exhibition were thematically linked, all of them part of Wieland's artistic turn towards Canada, but putting into question what it means to be a Canadian citizen, what it means to love Canada. The words here are spelled out in cushiony letters, and indeed the exhibition introduced a new category of artwork featuring quilting, embroidery, knitting, and other kinds of stitchery. These domestic arts had traditionally been associated with women and did not usually end up in art museums next to canonical paintings. So the True Patriot Love exhibition reclaimed and valorized this as a genuine form of artistic expression. And in so doing, Wieland was asserting, albeit in a quite a subtle way, that her nationalism was to be feminist in its orientation. And let me just point out that Wieland's work was truly groundbreaking in this respect. So Judy Chicago, the American artist Judy Chicago's dinner party, which also incorporated needlecraft in a very prominent way, only saw the light of day some years later. So Wieland was there first. So this is certainly not traditional craft. Here, craft is put into conversation with avant-garde strategies. So her nationalist fervor was informed by feminism, and it was also, at least in part, formulated in opposition to, well, in opposition to US technological imperialism. That delicate little embroidered sentence appears in English and French between I love and Canada. Wieland got the help of expert knitters and seamstresses to help her realize this project. But in this instance, on the left, she asked the knitters, who definitely were expert, to deliberately create these anamorphic flags. Are these disrespectful distortions? To my mind, not. It's as if the flag were a sweater that has been tried on by people of all different shapes and sizes. It's important to remember that the maple leaf flag had only recently, in 1965, been adopted as the national flag. So it's as if the artist was asking whether this new symbol was one size fits all, or whether it could be adapted and transformed by individual citizens. And on the right, O Canada animation, Wieland's animated lips remind us that the anthem too is something that, when sung, makes nationalism into an embodied experience. This was not a universally admired exhibition, and I decided to show you a couple of newspaper clippings to demonstrate that. So the Globe and Mail's reporter gave it extensive coverage, very positive, and the headline affirms that this is ardent and genuinely patriotic. The Ottawa Journal clipping did not appear on the art pages. This very negative response was an editorial. It was on the editorial pages. So titled "The Put On at the National Gallery," it goes on to say that the gallery is allowing itself to be conned by Wieland's work, which is embarrassing and gimmicky and all kinds of other. So, in other words, there were people who did not accept that True Patriot Love was a serious reflection on the cultural politics of nationalism. And you can, I think, barely see the top image, but it is captioned, "Joyce Wieland at work preparing Sweet Beaver, her perfume of Canadian liberation." And by the way, I'm serious about this, if anybody here happens to have kept one of those little perfume bottles as a souvenir, I'd love to see it, maybe take a photograph, better yet, sniff it. It could be said that all of the cloth works in the exhibition invited a tactile response. And with the perfume, and then with this enormous Arctic cake, it's as if Wieland was demonstrating how the experience of nationhood becomes multisensorial, which is a very McLuhan-esque proposition. And by the way, that's Pierre Thiberge standing next to Wieland. And in this photograph, we see Joyce Wieland, I would say, performing a much rehearsed Canadian persona. ready to confront the elements, wearing this vintage fur coat and snowshoes. And this persona has to be linked to the evolution of her thinking concerning the natural environment, and especially Canada's north. I already mentioned that her book work for the exhibition made use of a natural history book of Arctic flowers, and that's what she kind of used as the base, layering other images and text on top. With this work here, entitled Water Quilt, the pretty flowers that you see on the surface can get lifted up, revealing excerpts from a book, The Energy Poker Game, written by James Laxer and published only a year before Wieland made this work. So Laxer was a member of the NDP and one of the authors of the Waffle Manifesto. And in this book, he criticized the commodification of Canada's resources and American control of that marketplace. So I want to suggest that with this work, Wieland was forging a new kind of landscape art, one that incorporated both leftist politics and an ecological consciousness. But I just want to remind you, I didn't bring it in to show you again, but that work, 109 Views, that very colorful work, so there she has a kind of a really comic approach to landscape, and then here in the same exhibition, landscape is approached in this other way that is much more serious and ecological and political. So the landscape as a genre is something that she experiments with in many different ways. So finally here I'm showing you a couple of still images from Joyce Wieland's feature-length fiction film, The Far Shore, which was released in 1976. This project was on a scale unlike anything Wieland had ever done before, with a large cast and crew, many people behind the scenes as well, working, helping out, attempting to raise funds for the project. And we have Judy Steed here, who's one of those people. This was unlike any of Wieland's prior films because it was not obviously experimental. This was a story, with characters and dialogue. Still, if The Far Shore was a radical departure for Wieland in some ways, she herself described it as the culmination of her entire art practice. And I quote from her, "The Far Shore was pulling together everything I knew so far in life, what I knew so far about art." So it was only, in fact, in the 1980s that feminist scholars stepped up to defend Wieland's use of the melodrama genre. The film retells the story of Tom Thomson, but not from his point of view. Wieland invented a woman character who comes from Quebec, Eulalie, who is unhappily married to a Toronto engineer and who falls in love with Tom. And it is melodramatic. Sex, repressed emotion, violence, murder. Just as she had done in her True Patriot Love exhibition, grabbing hold of various national emblems and signs, here it is the figure of Thomson, the very symbol of Canadian art, who is reinvented as someone who doesn't only love forests, rocks, and streams. And along with Thomson, the genre of landscape also gets reimagined. The natural landscape comes into focus according to these main characters and according to competing desires that are commercial, geopolitical, aesthetic, and libidinal all at once. For Wieland, landscape is never merely background. So today, how we inhabit and represent the land is as important as ever. And as we ponder this question, Joyce Wieland continues to be an inspiration. Thanks very much.